The 1953 Studebaker that you see here is one of the most beautiful cars produced in the 50s and maybe even in all of automotive history. It certainly was a seminal design, particularly for the 1950s on a number of fronts. We're going to talk about that today by focusing in particular on the coupes. The sedans for 1953 weren't all that beautiful for various reasons, which we'll detail, but in particular, the Commander Starliner hardtop coupes were absolutely beautiful, like the one that you see here. Now, Studebaker really was in relatively healthy financial condition from the late 40s through 1952, at least when you compared it to other independents like Nash, Hudson, Willys, Packard, and Kaiser Frazer. It was America's best-selling independent automaker all the way through till 1957, and it often placed fourth in sales behind the divisions of Detroit's Big Three, Chevrolet, Ford, sometimes Plymouth or Buick. But Studebaker was always trying to come out with things that were advanced because it knew it had to compete with the big boys, so to speak. And it generally did so with success. Studebaker, in particular, after World War II, made a special effort to be first to the market, and it was the first independent car maker to offer a post-war overhead valve V8. And the 1947 model year Studebakers ended up reaching dealer showrooms before any of the other independents could get their cars out. Kaiser Frazer's would be out a few months after Studebakers, and Studebaker kind of introduced their post-war models a few years before General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford. So they really were quite innovative for the time. Now, of course, this innovativeness lent itself to some interesting designs, including the bullet nose Studebaker that was produced from 1950 to 1951. And, well, the competition really wasn't, let's say, paying attention to that bullet nose. I think many thought that it was too controversial. It was designed by Raymond Loewy and his associates, and Loewy was a famous industrial designer, and a number of Detroit luminaries from a styling perspective ended up working for Raymond Loewy, including Gordon Burig, who worked on the famous coffin nose Cord 810s, as well as Virgil Exner, who would later go on to Chrysler. Of course, there were more designers, one of whom we're going to talk about in greater detail, whose name was Bob Bork, who had a really tremendous influence on the 53 Studebaker, but other stylists in the Loewy and Associates offices during this time included Bob Cotto, who had been a designer of the 1949 Ford, Albrecht von Goertz, who was later a designer on the Datsun 240Z, Bob Andrews, who led the 1948 Hudson and 1963 Avanti styling, and Vince Gardner, who also helped create the 1936 Cord. Now, the original plan that Raymond Loewy and Studebaker executives had set out was that there would be an all-new body that would be introduced for 1952, Studebaker's 100th anniversary, and this was called the Model N. Unfortunately, the designers just couldn't get the Model N to look quite right, and they kept trying different things, and it didn't work out, and time kept passing by, so the desire to launch the all-new car for 1952 just didn't come to bear, and Raymond Loewy and his team had to warm over the bullet-nose Studebakers with the 1952s. But in 1953, there was going to be a potentially new car, although what Raymond Loewy asked his designers, led by Bob Bork, who headed Studebaker Design, to do was to design a show car. And, well, the designers went to work and came up with something similar to what was the production car for 1953. In fact, Bork and Bob Cotto actually competed against one another to come up with the appropriate proposal. Each did a half side of the clay model. And one of the great things about doing a show car was that the designers could play around a little bit with some things. More specifically, Bork made a few changes, namely that he wanted to employ the Studebaker Land Cruiser's longer 120.5-inch wheelbase versus the regular Studebaker's 116.5-inch frame. This really helped the car overall from a proportion standpoint, and it enabled the back seat to be placed ahead of the rear axle instead of over it. Now, as Bork and his team were working on what they thought was a show car, they got little hints that this wasn't necessarily going to be a show car after all. In fact, Some individuals were mentioning that they wanted Borg to help keep the overall production costs down in order to make the car more feasible. And at the end of the day, that's what happened. The so-called show car became what was produced for the 1953 Studebaker. Now, the overall car was revolutionary for its time on a number of fronts. Remember that the average car, if you look at the average 1953 automobile, it had a really tall stature to it, relatively tall front end and rear end. This was a time when Chevrolets were designed to carry those milk jugs in the trunk of them. And, well, that was not the design brief here for Studebaker. In fact, designers wanted the lowest possible hood, the lowest possible cowl, the lowest possible car overall. This was kind of the beginning of the lower, longer, wider look. And so the hood ended up being extremely low, as did the deck lid. And the car has this beautiful symmetric tapering front and rear that perhaps would be something that GM's future styling chief Bill Mitchell would espouse. He loved that tapered front and tapered rear look, and the 53 Studebaker had it, while many other cars of the era did not. The car also had these beautiful jet intakes and a split grille up front with mid-century modern-esque writing that said Studebaker on the left-hand side, and then the model name on the right-hand side. As an example, the Commander or the Champion. And these twin intakes kind of looked like jet air intakes, and that was purposeful because of where the design got some of its inspiration, namely from Lockheed aircraft. Designers would often tell that their inspiration was a Lockheed Commander aircraft of the period, and that really inspired the front end as well as the back end, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. But while we mentioned that distinct tapering front and rear and low overall height would be something that would set a new trend in styling for car design to come, so too did that split grille with those twin ports and the blades in the middle of them. Take a look at this Pontiac from 1962. Does that look familiar? I don't know if Pontiac stole the split grille in 1959 from Studebaker or not, but perhaps they took inspiration from it. The car also had an inspirational styling cue in those coves that were on the body sides, kind of scalloped out sections on the sides of the body that would be later used on a number of vehicles, like Corvettes as well as others. Up front, you also have a badge on the 8-cylinder Studebakers that has an 8 and a V, kind of a tri-pointed logo. And interestingly, Mercedes actually protested the design because of the 3 points. If you got a 6-cylinder Studebaker, it just had a stylized S in the middle of the V. It still was a tri-pointed design, but it didn't have the 8. And that's how one knew if you were driving an 8-cylinder Studebaker versus a 6. So the car was so revolutionary. We mentioned already the tapering front and rear, the low overall height. This car stood a total of 56.3 inches tall. The average height of cars during this time frame was about 63 inches. So it's 7 inches lower than normal, a pretty considerable margin there. And as we rotate out back, take a look at this beautiful little blade of chrome atop the rear quarter. And you see the taillights, they are separate from the bumper. The desire was actually for the designers to integrate the taillights into the bumper form, but Studebaker Engineering just thought that was going to cost too much. It's a bit unfortunate because that would have given the design an even greater harmony, but they just didn't have the money, like, for example, Cadillac did, to do something like that, or Lincoln or any up-level mark. This was Studebaker after all. But the deck lid does flow beautifully into the bumper, and those taillights, you can kind of visually imagine if they had been one piece with the bumper, would have looked even more dramatic. And it wasn't just the overall style and proportion of the car that would set new trends. It was even the detailing. We mentioned some things like those cutouts up front, the overall logo and how beautiful it was, the coves on the side. But some details like the wheel covers, these kind of conical shapes that were very simple and elegant, well, they would even inspire wheel covers in decades to come. Take a look at these wheel covers for AMCs from the late 1970s. Do you see any similarities to what's on the Studebakers of 1953? So the car set an overall interestingly new styling direction that was just fresh and unlike anything that was on the road for 1953. And under hood, there was some good news as well as some bad news, shall we say. Let's start with the duo of powertrains that one could get. The V8 engine was a 232 cubic inch overhead valve Studebaker V8 that made 120 horsepower. Now, unfortunately, Studebaker took an interesting tactic during this time frame. You notice I said that this was just 232 cubic inches overall. Some would say that Studebaker copied a little bit of the early Cadillac design in coming out with their overhead valve V8. But nonetheless, the Studebaker V8 ended up considerably smaller, almost 100 cubic inches smaller than the Cadillac 331 cubic inch overhead valve V8 that debuted for the 1949 model year compared to Studebaker's engine, which debuted in 1951. So why in the world did Studebaker come out with such a small V8? Well, you have to remember that this was before the trend to performance, and Studebaker's engineers were presumably just trying to modernize the old school big six-cylinder engine they had under hood in many Studebakers prior to 1951. More specifically, the big 245.6 cubic inch inline six-cylinder engine that Studebaker was employing in part of their lineup before 1951 made about 100 horsepower, and so it was viewed overall as a success that Studebaker was able to come out with a smaller displacement V8, displacing just 232 cubic inches and making 20% more power, 120 brake horsepower, and it was more fuel efficient too. So the engine was not designed necessarily with performance in mind, but rather economy. And it had some conservative engineering built in, like a 7-to-1 overall compression ratio. Later, there would be an optional higher compression ratio for high altitude conditions. But the overall engine was just not something that was designed for performance. And by 1953, Studebaker was starting to lose out and would soon lose out to other vehicles like the Ford Y-block engine-powered cars, the Chevrolet small-block engine-powered cars that would deliver better performance, and the engine blocks were set up to make them larger and larger and larger. Instead, Studebaker was banking on the fact that it could keep increasing the compression ratios as gasoline became more and more refined, that there could be more and more octane, and they could run compression ratios up to, they thought, 14-to-1. And that was how they were going to get more power, was through increased compression ratios. Alas, the super high octane fuels just never came to being, and you didn't see cars running around with 14-to-1 compression ratios, though in the 1960s, some stock engines would get to be 11-to-1 or thereabouts. Another interesting point about the engine under hood, which you see here, was that Studebaker engineers, of course, had to engineer the air cleaner assembly and the overall engine to make sure that it could fit under that very low hood, hence the air cleaner off to the side. This would be something that was replicated on some Chrysler models in the late 1950s as well, to make sure that they could have a low overall hood design too. So Studebaker was pioneering not only in the styling, but also how to basically execute the styling functionally with changes in their underhood design. Now, unfortunately, while some things were innovative under hood, like that air cleaner assembly, the overall underbody of the car was not. And the Achilles heel of these 53 Studebakers was the frame. The so-called cowbelly frame was not a perimeter frame, and it was not very strong at all. In fact, take a look at the frame. You can just see visually that the gauge thickness is not that great. And this created a number of problems for Studebaker as they were producing the 1953 models. More specifically, that when the engine was dropped in, the V8 engine was dropped in, the bodies would flex and bend and they couldn't be mated up appropriately. So what did Studebaker do? No, they didn't go redesign the entire frame, of course. They decided to shim the frame to the body gap with some basically tire-like rubber. And I think in this picture that you see here, that's what you're seeing, is some of those original tire-style shims in order to help the deflection of the frame. It's crazy, but this is what they actually did. And unfortunately, because of the flexible frames, these cars do not drive that well. One of the Studebaker engineers in the program actually said that the doors talk to you when you are driving over rough road, and that's probably a polite version of how to say that the car just has a bunch of squeaks, creaks, and rattles, unfortunately. Another fault of the engineering here was that the door latches were notoriously poor, allegedly because the chief engineer, who by this time was a colonel, I don't think that he had any background in engineering, was able to source the door latches for 15 cents cheaper than a better design. And, well, the supplier allegedly promised him that they were going to make these door latches so that they would actually stay closed, but in fact they didn't, and they sometimes had a tendency to pop open if you went over especially rough railroad tracks because the body was torquing so much and the latches were not all that strong. Now, interestingly, that individual was later fired because he was getting kickbacks from the door latch supplier. So you can understand what the quality was overall on the 53 Studebakers. And it's really a shame because the intent was not for this to be a cheaply engineered car in general overall. In fact, the engineers specified that a 13-gauge steel would be employed for the frame as opposed to 11-gauge, which was thicker. And the idea there was that the actual chassis would be a bit more flexible, and that would help absorb road shocks. And the engineers felt that the body structure would be strong enough to compensate for the frame's flexibility. And unfortunately, that was true, except when, as I mentioned, the engine was dropped in. Studebaker also had some interesting engineering that they were trying to employ on this 53 model, and that included mechanical power steering, not hydraulic power steering. But they actually had a very complicated setup that was devised by Borg-Warner that they outfitted in some of these vehicles. I don't think any of them survive, and the contract with Borg-Warner was canceled. But it was a mechanical setup with discs inside of it, driven off of the engine's crankshaft pulley, and that was how the power steering worked. Effectively, these discs, these clutches would spin, and when you turn the wheel to the left or the right, they would mate up and help provide power assist. So it was not a hydraulic setup. Like I said, I don't think any of those survived, but that was the original intent of the engineers at Borg-Warner, and Studebaker, like I said, ended up canceling that contract. However, the result was that the Studebakers garnered a reputation for shoddy engineering because they weren't all that well assembled in 1953, and they didn't drive very well because of what I mentioned with the frame. And so that word got out in the public, and while you think that sales would accelerate over time, in fact, in 1953, Studebaker sold about 170,000 cars across its lineup. In 1954, it sold just 81,000. So it was not something that helped Studebaker gain momentum in the sales department, despite the overall beauty of the car. Now, the beauty really just extended to the coupes, in particular the hardtop coupe, but the four-doors were put on the shorter wheelbase. Interestingly, the two-doors, as I mentioned, were on the longer 120.5-inch wheelbase. The four-doors were on the 116.5-inch wheelbase, and they were not endowed with the same graceful proportions that the coupes were. So, oh well, that is what it is. Eventually, some fixes would be in for the car for 1954, and the 54 Studebakers would be better built, and the engine eventually would end up getting larger. It would, I think, hit a max of 313 cubic inches in the Avanti R5, but at that displacement, it was really the extent of how large the engine could go, as opposed to the Chevrolet small block, for instance, which was able to make it all the way to 400 cubic inches, albeit with Siamese cylinder walls. So the Studebaker for 1953 was a gorgeous car. It just unfortunately didn't drive that well. One thing I did mention the 120 horsepower V8, which was the top engine option. Well, in a car like this, that meant that 0 to 60 took about 15, 16 seconds, depending upon which transmission that you had in the car. And so performance was not the strong suit of the Studebaker either, unfortunately. And that's the story of the 53 Studebaker, a seminal design in many respects, kind of the first of the longer, lower, wider cars, a beautifully proportioned vehicle, stunning to see even today. But with all of those flaws, just not a car that helped Studebaker and perhaps also helped contribute to its untimely demise. And interestingly, now, perhaps because of the reasons I mentioned, 53 Studebakers, unless you're getting one of the hardtop coupes, they're pretty gosh darn cheap to pick up. Even the hardtop coupes are now going for, in mint condition, around $30,000. But if you just wanted a standard pillared coupe, like a Commander, as an example, you might be able to get a nice one for $20,000. They're relatively inexpensive. Just bear in mind that you're not going to have a great driving experience to accompany the style. What do you think of the 53 Studebakers? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.